Good evening, everyone. Before tonight's whispered tales begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Where are you listening from, and what time is it? The more you engage, the more these untold stories will haunt your feed. Now, let's uncover the secrets together. I've been using dating apps on and off for about 3 years now, and I thought I had pretty good instincts about people. I'd gone on plenty of first dates, some good, some awkward, but nothing that ever made me genuinely afraid. That changed last September when I matched with someone who seemed absolutely perfect on paper. We talked for almost a month before meeting up, and the conversation just flowed. He was funny, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. He worked in tech, loved hiking, and we bonded over our shared obsession with true crime podcasts. The irony of that last part isn't lost on me now. When he suggested we skip the typical coffee date and have dinner at his place instead, I hesitated. He explained that his apartment was being renovated, and the kitchen was one of the few finished rooms. Plus, he loved cooking and wanted to make something special. He sent me pictures of partially renovated rooms, paint samples, the whole thing. It seemed legitimate, and after a month of talking, I felt like I knew him well enough. My friends told me it was a bad idea, but I was in my mid-20s and thought I was being overly cautious for no reason. I texted my roommate his address and told her to check in with me by 9. The neighborhood was actually really nice when I pulled up, which made me feel better about my decision. It was one of those older houses that had been converted into separate units. He met me at a side entrance that led down to the basement apartment, apologizing again for the construction mess upstairs. The door was heavy, wooden, and he had to unlock it with a key. I didn't think much of it at the time. The apartment itself was dimly lit, which he blamed on having limited lighting installed so far. There was a small kitchen area, a living space with a couch and TV, and a hallway that I assumed led to the bedroom and bathroom. Everything was neat but sparse, like someone had just moved in. We made small talk while he finished preparing dinner, and I started to relax. The food smelled amazing, and he poured us both wine. We sat down to eat, and the conversation picked up right where our messages had left off. That's when I noticed the shelf on the wall behind him. It was a floating shelf, the kind you'd display books or plants on, but instead it held what looked like jewelry and small personal items. There was a delicate gold necklace with a small pendant, a purple hair scrunchie, a phone case with a floral pattern, and a few other things I couldn't quite make out in the low light. I asked him about it, trying to keep my tone casual, and he glanced back at the shelf with this small smile. "Oh, those are from my ex," he said, turning back to his plate. "Just haven't gotten around to giving them back yet." Something about the way he said it felt off, but I nodded and changed the subject. We kept talking, but my eyes kept drifting back to that shelf. The items looked too different to belong to one person. The necklace seemed delicate and expensive, while the scrunchie was the kind you'd buy in a multi-pack. There was a keychain with a college logo, a silver bracelet, and what looked like a pair of earrings. As dinner went on and my eyes adjusted to the lighting, I counted at least 8 or 9 distinct items. "That's a lot of stuff from one ex," I said, trying to sound lighthearted. He laughed. "Yeah, she left things here over time. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was, because no one leaves that many random items at someone's place unless they practically live there. And even then, why would he display them like trophies? My stomach started to knot up, and I realized I'd barely touched my wine. I excused myself to use the bathroom, needing a moment to think. The bathroom was at the end of the short hallway, and when I tried to close the door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The lock required a key from both sides. Not a normal bathroom lock that you could just flip, but an actual keyed deadbolt on both the inside and outside of the door. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind racing for an innocent explanation. Maybe it was a safety thing for the renovation. But who puts a double-keyed lock on a bathroom door? I looked around the small bathroom with new eyes. It was very basic, almost sterile. No personal items, no decorations. I quietly tried the door handle again, confirming what I'd seen. My hands were shaking now. I flushed the toilet and ran the water, trying to act normal while my heart pounded in my chest. When I came out, I glanced at the front door we'd entered through. It had the same type of lock, a keyed deadbolt that required a key from both sides. I was locked in. The realization hit me like ice water. I couldn't just walk out if I wanted to. I needed him to unlock the door to let me leave. I stood there in the hallway for a few seconds, forcing myself to breathe normally, to think clearly. I could feel panic rising in my throat, but I knew I had to stay calm. I walked back to the table and sat down, picking up my fork, even though the thought of eating made me nauseous. He was watching me with this pleasant expression, asking if I was okay. I smiled and said the wine was hitting me harder than I expected, that I was feeling a little dizzy. His expression shifted to concern, but there was something else there too, something I couldn't quite read. "Maybe you should lie down for a bit," he suggested, gesturing toward the hallway. "Actually, I think I need some fresh air," I said, standing up carefully. "Would you mind walking me out to my car? I'm so sorry, I just need to go home." He stood too, but he didn't move toward the door. "Are you sure? You really don't look good. You shouldn't drive like this." My phone was in my purse on the couch. I grabbed it, clutching it like a lifeline. "I'll be fine. I just really need to get going. My roommate's expecting me." I said it loudly, clearly, wanting him to know that someone knew where I was. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating something. Finally, he pulled out his keys and walked to the door. The sound of the deadbolt turning was the sweetest thing I'd ever heard. The moment the door opened, I practically ran up those basement steps. He called after me, but I was already at my car, fumbling with my keys. I locked the doors the second I got in and drove straight to the police station. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. The police took my statement and said they'd check it out. 2 days later, an officer called me back. They'd found items in that apartment belonging to 3 different women who'd been reported missing over the past 18 months. I was 32 years old when my buddies decided I needed to get back out there. I'd been single for almost a year after a rough breakup, and they kept insisting they knew someone perfect for me. She was a friend of a friend, worked in marketing, loved dogs, the whole pitch. I finally agreed to meet her at this coffee shop downtown on a Saturday afternoon. I figured worst case scenario, I'd have an awkward hour and then go home. I had no idea I was about to experience the most humiliating moment of my life. She seemed nice enough when I first sat down. A little nervous, fidgeting with her cup, but I chalked that up to normal first date jitters. We made small talk about work, the weather, typical stuff. I was maybe 10 minutes into telling her about my job in construction when 3 people suddenly appeared at our table. 2 women and a guy, all probably in their late 20s. And they looked furious. The taller woman slammed her hand on the table and said, "So you're just going to sit here and pretend like nothing happened?" I literally had no idea what she was talking about. I looked at my date, confused, and she had tears streaming down her face. The guy with them leaned in close and said, "We know what you did to her. She told us everything." I tried to explain that I had no clue what was happening, that this was literally our first date, but they weren't listening. My date was sobbing now, and one of the women had her arm around her shoulders. They started listing off things I'd supposedly done. Controlling behavior, checking her phone, threatening her family, isolating her from friends. The accusations just kept coming, each one more insane than the last. I kept saying we'd never even met before today, but they talked over me. The coffee shop was packed, and every single person was staring at us. Someone had their phone out, recording the whole thing. The guy leaned in and called me a piece of garbage, said I was lucky they were handling this civilly instead of beating the hell out of me right there. I pulled out my phone, desperate to prove something, anything. I showed them the dating app messages, showed them that our first conversation was literally 3 days ago. The texts were all there, proving we'd never met before this exact moment. One of the women, the shorter one with red hair, actually looked at my phone. I watched her face change as she scrolled through the messages, seeing the timestamps, seeing that everything I said was true. She looked up at my date, confused, and said her name with this questioning tone. That's when I saw something that still haunts me. My date looked directly at me, and for just a split second the tears stopped. Her face went completely blank, almost cold. Then, just as quickly, she was crying again. The red-haired woman showed the phone to the others, and I could see doubt creeping into their expressions. But my date doubled down. She started saying I must have created a fake profile, that I was stalking her, that this was exactly the kind of manipulative thing I would do. The other two wanted to believe her, I could tell. They wanted me to be the villain. But the evidence was right there in black and white. I stood up because I needed to get out of there. Everyone in the coffee shop was still watching, whispering, judging. I threw a 20 on the table and told them to figure it out amongst themselves. As I walked toward the door, my date called out, "You can't just leave. We're not done talking about this." Her voice had this edge to it that didn't match the crying from seconds before. I turned around and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that I'd never met her before today, that I had proof in my phone, and that if she continued to harass me, I'd be calling the police. The look she gave me then was pure hatred. Not hurt, not sadness. Just cold, calculated anger that I wasn't playing along. I left and sat in my truck for 20 minutes, shaking. I couldn't understand what had just happened, or why. When I got home, I did what anyone would do and started Googling. I typed in her first name, along with words like scam and setup. That's when I found them. Forum posts and Reddit threads from other guys describing almost identical situations. Different cities, different coffee shops, but the same basic story. A first date that turned into a public ambush with friends who believed she was being abused. One post linked to a fundraising page she'd set up months earlier, claiming she needed money to escape an abusive relationship. It had raised thousands of dollars. The comments were full of supportive messages from people who believed her story. There were photos of her with a black eye that was obviously makeup, screenshots of fake threatening texts. The whole thing was elaborately constructed. I contacted two of the guys who'd posted about her, and we compared notes. Same pattern every time. Meet someone new, stage a dramatic intervention, play the victim. Sometimes she got money directly. Sometimes it was just attention and sympathy. One guy said she'd done it to him twice with different friend groups before he realized it was the same person. I never heard from her again, but I check that fundraising page sometimes. It's still up. People still donate. And I wonder how many other guys are out there, sitting in coffee shops right now, about to have their lives turned upside down by someone who's perfected the art of playing victim. Have you ever had someone accuse you of something you absolutely didn't do? How did you prove your innocence? Drop your experience in the comments. I work as a nurse in a toxicology unit, so I'd like to think I know the warning signs when something's off with someone's system. I've seen enough cases of intentional poisoning and drugging to recognize the symptoms pretty quickly. What I never expected was that I'd need to use that knowledge to save myself on what was supposed to be a casual dinner date. This happened about 8 months ago, and I still get paranoid every time I go out with someone new. I matched with this guy on one of those apps where you actually have to put effort into your profile. He claimed to work as a pharmaceutical sales representative, which made sense to me since we had the medical field in common. Our conversations were great. He asked intelligent questions, seemed genuinely interested in my work, and we set up a date at this Italian place across town. When I arrived, he was already seated and had ordered a bottle of wine. He said he wanted it to breathe before I got there, which seemed thoughtful at the time. Dinner started off perfectly normal. We talked about our jobs, and that's when small inconsistencies started popping up. I'd mention a specific drug, and he'd nod along but then say something that didn't quite make sense. He called a common antibiotic by the wrong classification. He mixed up basic pharmaceutical terminology that anyone in that field would know cold. I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was nervous or worked in a different area of pharma that didn't require that knowledge. He excused himself to use the restroom, and I sat there playing with my wine glass. The lighting in the restaurant hit it at just the right angle, and I noticed something. There was a very faint, oily residue along the rim, almost like a film. It wasn't there on his glass. I held mine up to the light, turning it slowly, and my stomach dropped. That residue shouldn't be there. The restaurant was too upscale for dirty glassware. I took a tiny sip earlier when we first sat down, just being polite. Now, my mind was racing through every substance I'd seen come through the emergency room. I set the glass down carefully and waited for him to come back. When he did, he immediately encouraged me to drink, saying the wine was exceptional and I was barely touching it. He even made a joke about how he'd be offended if I didn't at least finish the glass. That's when I felt it. A slight tingling in my fingertips. A mild sense of dissociation that wasn't consistent with the single small sip of wine I'd had. I know my tolerance, and I know the difference between alcohol and something else. This was something else. My clinical brain kicked into gear, running through possibilities. The onset was too fast for most benzodiazepines, but too subtle for GHB. Whatever it wasn't going to knock me out immediately, which meant he was counting on me drinking more. I pretended to take another sip, but instead pressed my lips together and let the wine barely touch my mouth before setting the glass down. He was watching me so intently. Not my face, not my eyes, but specifically watching to see if I swallowed. When I did this twice more, bringing the glass to my lips but not actually drinking, he started to look agitated. He called the waiter over and ordered another bottle, saying this one must be off since I wasn't enjoying it. The waiter looked confused because I hadn't complained, but brought another bottle anyway. My date poured a fresh glass and slid it toward me with this smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said we should make a toast, that he wanted to see me actually drink with him. The pressure in his voice was unmistakable. I made an excuse about needing the restroom and stood up carefully, testing my balance. The room tilted slightly. Definitely drugged. In the bathroom, I stuck my fingers down my throat and forced myself to vomit. It was violent and unpleasant, but necessary. I rinsed my mouth, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at myself in the mirror. My pupils were slightly dilated. I had maybe ingested enough to make me vulnerable, but not enough to incapacitate me completely. I needed to get out of there, but I also needed to do it smart. I went back to the table and told him I suddenly wasn't feeling well. I made my voice a little slurred, like the drug was taking effect. His whole demeanor changed. He became overly solicitous, concerned, suggesting we skip dessert and go back to his place since I clearly needed to lie down. He even offered to drive me since I seemed too unsteady. The fact that he was so prepared with this suggestion told me everything I needed to know. I pulled out my phone and loudly said I was calling my roommate to come get me. I made sure the people at nearby tables could hear me giving his description and our exact location. His expression went from concerned to ice cold in seconds. He actually looked angry, like I'd ruined something he'd been planning. The waiter came over, sensing tension, and asked if everything was all right. I said clearly that I felt ill and needed help to my car. The waiter, bless him, immediately offered to walk me out and even said he'd wait with me until my ride came. My date didn't follow us. He just sat there, jaw clenched, staring at his untouched food. I gave the waiter a huge tip and waited in my car with the doors locked until I felt steady enough to drive to the emergency room. They ran a tox screen that came back positive for a sedative I won't name here, but it's commonly used in these situations. I filed a police report and found out later that he'd been arrested before in another state for similar incidents. Different name, same pattern. The pharmaceutical rep's story was completely fabricated. What would you do if you suspected your drink had been tampered with? Would you confront the person or just leave? Let me know your safety strategies below. Looking back now, I realize that grief makes you vulnerable in ways you don't expect. I lost my wife to cancer when I was 41, and for months afterward, I couldn't imagine ever connecting with anyone again. My therapist suggested a support group for people who'd lost spouses, and I went reluctantly. That's where I met her. She was soft-spoken, kind, and seemed to understand the specific kind of pain I was going through. She'd supposedly lost her husband to the same type of cancer just a year before my wife passed. We bonded over the strange, terrible details that only people who've watched someone die slowly would understand. We started meeting for coffee after the group sessions. Nothing romantic at first, just two people who got it. She knew exactly what to say when I talked about the guilt of feeling relieved when it was finally over. She understood the anger at doctors who couldn't do more. She even knew about the weird financial stress that comes with medical debt after everything else. 6 months after we met, we started actually dating. It felt right, like we were helping each other heal. She integrated into my life seamlessly. My friends loved her. My sister thought she was good for me. She'd come over and we'd cook dinner together. And for the first time since losing my wife, my house felt less empty. About 3 months into dating, she broke down one night and told me she was drowning in her late husband's medical bills. The hospital was threatening collections, and she was terrified of losing her house. She showed me paperwork that looked legitimate, bills with astronomical numbers that I recognized from my own experience. I lent her $8,000 without hesitation. How could I not? I knew exactly what she was going through. 2 weeks later, I was grabbing coffee at a place across town, somewhere I never usually go. I was waiting in line when I saw her through the window of the bagel shop next door. She was with a man and 2 kids, and they were laughing. Really laughing. The kind of easy family happiness that takes years to build. The man had his arm around her waist. One of the kids, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, was holding her hand and swinging it back and forth. They looked completely comfortable together, like they did this every weekend. My first thought was that it must be her late husband's brother or something, helping with his kids. But then I saw him kiss her. Not a friendly peck, a real kiss. And she kissed him back. The little girl made a disgusted face, and the boy laughed. It was so casual, so natural. I stood there, frozen, coffee forgotten, just watching the scene that made no sense with everything she'd told me. I followed them at a distance, which I know sounds creepy, but I needed to understand what I was seeing. They went to a park and spent an hour there. The man pushed the kids on swings. She took photos of all of them together. They packed up and headed to a parking lot where they all got into the same car, a minivan with kid stuff visible in the back. They drove to a residential neighborhood and pulled into a driveway. All 4 of them went inside a house like they lived there. I sat in my truck down the street for 30 minutes, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was an open casket situation and I'd misunderstood. Maybe she'd remarried quickly and was embarrassed to tell me. Maybe I was losing my mind. Finally, I drove home and did something I should have done months ago. I looked her up online. Really looked her up, not just the casual social media check I'd done when we first met. Her husband's profile was active, very active. Posted photos from a work conference 2 days ago. Tagged in a restaurant check-in with her last week. Their anniversary post from 3 months back with a long caption about 15 years of marriage. I went back through years of posts. He'd never been sick. There were no hospital photos, no fundraisers, no mentions of cancer. Just a normal, healthy, apparently happy family. I felt physically sick. I called her and asked her to come over, said we needed to talk. She showed up an hour later looking concerned, asking what was wrong. I told her I'd seen her that morning with her husband and kids. I watched her face carefully. For just a second, there was panic. Then she laughed and said, I must have seen someone who looked like her. When I described the exact bagel shop, the park, the minivan, she switched tactics. Said it was complicated, that she and her husband were separated but still doing family things for the kids, that she was going to tell me eventually. I showed her the social media posts, the anniversary message, the photos from last week. She had an explanation for everything, each one more elaborate than the last. They were faking it for family. The posts were old. I was reading things wrong, but I could see her scrambling, adjusting her story as each explanation fell apart. Then I told her about the other posts I'd found, forum discussions from two different men describing eerily similar situations. Both had met her at grief support groups in other cities. Both had been told the exact same story about a husband dying of cancer and crushing medical debt. Both had given her money. One guy had screenshots of the same hospital bills she'd shown me, just with different names. She stood up, and her whole demeanor changed. No more tears, no more explanations. She told me coldly that if I tried to cause problems for her, she'd tell everyone I'd been harassing her family, that she had resources and connections I didn't, that I should consider the money a loss and move on unless I wanted real trouble. I never got my money back, but I did contact the other guys. We filed reports, though nothing ever came of them. She's still out there, probably still going to grief groups. Have you ever trusted someone completely only to discover they were lying about everything? What made you finally see the truth? It happened when I was 24 and still in grad school. There was this massive house party that one of my classmates threw, the kind where half the campus shows up and you end up meeting people you've never seen before. I spent most of the night talking to this guy who seemed cool, funny, good-looking, and we had that easy chemistry where conversation just flows. Around midnight, my roommate texted that she was heading out with some guys she'd met, and I suddenly realized I didn't have a ride home. The buses had stopped running, and surge pricing on rideshare apps was insane. He offered to drive me, and I didn't think twice about it. We'd been talking for 3 hours. He seemed completely safe. His car was parked a few blocks away, and we walked there still laughing about something stupid from the party. I got in the passenger seat and gave him my address. He plugged it into his phone and started driving. The first few minutes were fine, just more conversation, but then he made a turn that seemed wrong. I mentioned it casually, saying I thought my place was the other direction. He said he knew a faster route, that the main roads would be packed with traffic from bars letting out. It seemed reasonable enough, except then he got on the highway, and my apartment was definitely not in that direction. I told him more firmly that he was going the wrong way, but he just smiled and said to trust him. The word trust coming out of his mouth suddenly felt wrong. I tried to casually reach for the door handle like I was just adjusting my position, and my heart absolutely stopped. The door wouldn't open. I tried again, less casually this time, actually pulling on it. Nothing. Child lock. I looked over at him, and he was watching my reaction out of the corner of his eye. He had this little smirk, like he was enjoying seeing me figure it out. I forced myself to stay calm and said lightly that the door seemed stuck. He said, "Oh yeah, the child locks are on. His niece and nephew ride in his car sometimes, so he keeps them engaged." But the way he said it, so casual and unconcerned that I was literally trapped, made my skin crawl. We were driving further away from campus, further from anything familiar. He made a comment about how he really liked me, that he thought we had a connection. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said maybe I wasn't ready to go home yet, that we should spend more time together. I told him I had an early class and really needed to get back. He completely ignored me and changed the subject, asking what my favorite movie was like we were still on a casual date. I pulled out my phone to text my roommate, and his entire energy shifted. He asked sharply who I was texting. I lied and said my mom, that she always checks in when I'm out late. He relaxed slightly and told me that was sweet, that I was a good daughter. The way he said good made me feel sick. We were passing fewer exits now, heading into an area with more warehouses and empty lots. I was genuinely terrified. I remembered something my self-defense instructor had taught us. If you're trapped in a car with someone, the only leverage you have is making them stop the vehicle. I told him I was going to throw up. He didn't react at first, so I made retching sounds and put my hand over my mouth. He told me to hold it, that we'd be somewhere soon. I made the sounds more urgent, adding a gagging noise. Still nothing. So I leaned forward and started making full heaving motions like I was about to vomit all over his dashboard. That got him. He swore and jerked the car toward an exit, pulling into a rest stop that looked completely deserted. It was one of those old ones, barely lit, with a bathroom building and nothing else. He barely had the car in park before I was grabbing for the door, but it still wouldn't open from the inside. I was actually starting to panic when he finally reached over and unlocked it manually. The second I heard that click, I shoved the door open and ran. I sprinted toward the bathroom building because it was the only structure with lights on. I could hear him yelling behind me, calling me crazy, saying he was just trying to help me. I got to the women's restroom and burst through the door. There was a woman inside, probably in her 50s, wearing a trucker cap and washing her hands. I must have looked absolutely terrified because she immediately asked what was wrong. I told her in a rush that the guy outside had locked me in his car and driven me somewhere I didn't ask to go. She didn't hesitate. She told me to stay right there, pulled out her phone and called the cops. Then she walked to the bathroom door, opened it, and yelled out that the police were on their way, and she'd gotten his license plate number. I don't know if she actually had, but it worked. I heard his car start up and peel out of the parking lot. She stayed with me until the police arrived 20 minutes later. She even drove me back to campus herself, refusing to leave me there alone. The cops got his plate number from the rest stop cameras and told me later he had priors. 2 previous charges for false imprisonment that had been pleaded down. Apparently, I wasn't the first woman who'd gotten into his car thinking she was just getting a ride home. I never went to another house party after that, and I've never gotten in a car with someone I just met, no matter how nice they seem or how long we've been talking. 3 hours of conversation doesn't mean you actually know someone. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to physically escape from someone? What's your go-to safety move when things feel off? I've always been into photography, so when I met someone at an art gallery opening who shared that passion, it felt like fate. We spent the whole evening discussing composition and lighting, and she showed me some of her work on her phone. Her shots were actually incredible, moody black and white street photography that had real emotion to it. We exchanged numbers and started going out regularly. She always had her camera with her, which I found charming. She'd take candid shots of the cityscape, interesting strangers, sometimes me. I'd laugh and pose or pretend to be annoyed. It felt playful and artistic, like we were documenting our relationship as it developed. What I appreciated most was that she wasn't clingy. She didn't text obsessively or need constant attention. She had her own life, her own friends, and respected my space. We'd been seeing each other for about 6 weeks when one of my coworkers pulled me aside during lunch and asked if I knew someone was posting about me all over social media. I was confused because the woman I was dating barely posted anything. Her public profiles were minimal, maybe 1 photo a month, nothing personal. My coworker showed me her phone, and my stomach dropped. It was a private account under a slightly different username, but it was definitely her, and it was full of me. Not just a few photos, but hundreds. There were shots from our dates at restaurants, but taken from angles I didn't remember her using. Pictures of me walking to my car after work, at the gym on my lunch break, sitting in a coffee shop I'd gone to alone. The timestamps showed some were taken weeks before we'd even had our first date. I scrolled through, feeling more sick with each image. There were photos of me through my apartment window. I live on the 2nd floor, and these were clearly taken from the parking lot with a zoom lens. Me cooking dinner, watching television, working at my desk, all captioned with things like, "Love watching him in his element," and "He doesn't know I'm here, but I am." There were screenshots of text messages I'd sent her with long analytical captions breaking down what I really meant versus what I'd actually said. She'd created entire narratives around simple texts about grabbing dinner or asking how her day went. One folder was labeled Our Future, and I should have stopped looking, but I couldn't. Inside were photoshopped images of us at a wedding, wearing formal clothes neither of us owned, in a venue I'd never seen. She'd taken our faces and merged them digitally to create what our children might look like, 4 different variations, each with names and birth dates planned out. There were screenshots of houses for sale, with comments about which one would be perfect for us. Posts about how she knew we were soulmates because of astrological compatibility she'd calculated. The worst part was the photos from before we'd met. She'd been following me for months. There were pictures from a work conference I'd attended in another state, shots of me at a friend's barbecue, images from a hiking trail I'd posted about once in a running group. She'd systematically documented my life without me having any idea she existed. The earliest photo I could find was from almost 4 months before she'd randomly shown up at that gallery opening. I felt violated in a way I'd never experienced before. Every moment I'd thought was private had been observed and cataloged. I called her immediately, and she answered cheerfully like nothing was wrong. I asked her about the private account, and there was a long pause before she said, "One of her friends must have accepted my coworker's follow request by mistake." I told her I'd seen everything, all the photos, the captions, the photoshopped images. Her tone shifted completely. She started crying and saying she thought I'd find it romantic, that she was just documenting how much she cared about me. I asked about the photos from before we met, the ones through my window, the ones from the conference in another state. She got defensive and said I was overreacting, that I posted publicly about where I was going. So how was it her fault if she happened to be in the same places? She actually tried to turn it around on me, saying I was being paranoid and ungrateful because she'd put so much effort into our relationship. The fact that she genuinely seemed to believe this behavior was normal made it so much worse. I ended things right there on the phone and told her not to contact me again. She oscillated between begging me to reconsider and screaming that I was ruining everything we'd built together. I hung up and immediately went through my apartment, closing every curtain and blind. I felt exposed, like the walls were transparent. That night, I contacted the building management about installing better window coverings and asked about security camera footage from the parking lot. The harassment didn't stop. She created new accounts to message me, showed up at places she knew I'd be, left printed copies of her favorite photos of us on my car windshield. I had to get a restraining order, which she violated twice before finally backing off. Even now, 8 months later, I catch myself scanning parking lots for her car and keeping my blinds closed even during the day. I had to make all my social media completely private and stopped posting about my location entirely. The thing that haunts me most is wondering how many moments I thought were coincidences were actually her orchestrating our meeting. Did she really just happen to love the same obscure photographer I mentioned once online? Was that gallery opening actually random, or had she been waiting for me to show up? I'll never know how much of what I thought was genuine connection was actually just her executing a plan she'd been developing for months. Has anyone ever crossed the line from interested to obsessed with you? How did you realize something was wrong, and what did you do about it? I was 31 and working a stressful tech job when I started getting into hiking and outdoor activities to decompress. I joined a local hiking group that did weekend trips, and that's where I met him. He was really into fitness and wellness, always talking about clean eating and meditation, which seemed harmless enough. We hit it off and started dating casually. 2 months in, he invited me to a wellness weekend retreat with some friends of his. He described it as camping mixed with yoga and healthy cooking workshops, basically a chance to unplug and reset. I'd been burnt out from work, so it sounded perfect. He sent me a packing list that emphasized bringing comfortable clothes for movement and meditation. One thing that stood out was a note saying, Phones weren't allowed because it was a full digital detox experience. He said chargers would just be dead weight, so I should leave mine at home. I thought it was a bit extreme, but also kind of refreshing. I told my sister where I'd be going and what weekend, then headed out early Saturday morning. The location was about 2 hours into the mountains, down a dirt road that got progressively more isolated. When we finally arrived, I was surprised by how many people were there. At least 30 or 40, maybe more. The setup looked semi-permanent, with a main lodge building and several smaller cabins arranged in a circle. Everyone was friendly in that intense way, where they make way too much eye contact and touch your arm when they talk. The first session was yoga at sunrise, which seemed normal enough, though the instructor kept talking about awakening your true frequency and shedding societal programming. After yoga, we had a breakfast that was basically just fruit and nuts, which they called a cleansing meal. Then came what they described as group sharing circles. We sat in the main lodge, and people started opening up about deep personal trauma, childhood abuse, addiction, relationship failures, things you'd normally only tell a therapist. The facilitators encouraged everyone to really let go, to scream if they needed to physically express their pain. People were sobbing, actually screaming, rolling on the floor. It was intense in a way that felt less like healing and more like breaking people down. My boyfriend participated fully, and he seemed totally different from the guy I knew. He used all this specific terminology about ascending consciousness and breaking free from the matrix of normal society. He talked about how most people are asleep, and only the enlightened ones can see reality clearly. When it was my turn to share, I talked briefly about work stress, keeping it surface level. I could feel the facilitators weren't happy with that. They said I was blocked, that I was resisting the process, that I needed to go deeper to truly heal. That night at dinner, which was just vegetable broth, I told my boyfriend I was tired and wanted to leave in the morning. He looked genuinely confused and said we couldn't leave until the full process was complete. I laughed it off, assuming he meant it would be rude to bail early, but he explained that for safety reasons, once you start the intensive breakthrough work, you have to finish all the sessions or it could be psychologically dangerous. The facilitators had to guide you back to baseline. Leaving mid-process could cause serious harm. I went to our assigned cabin and tried the door. It was locked from the outside. I tested the windows, also locked. When I asked about it, someone explained it was for protection from wildlife and to prevent people from wandering off disoriented during the deep emotional work. They made it sound completely reasonable, but my gut was screaming that something was wrong. I'd noticed there were always at least 2 facilitators positioned near the main exit. Nobody seemed to come or go. The next day started at 5 in the morning with meditation, then more intense sharing sessions. But now they were focusing on people who were resisting, which included me. They had the whole group confront me about my walls, my fear of vulnerability, my need to control everything. It went on for hours. No lunch, just water, because apparently eating would dull the emotional breakthroughs they were trying to facilitate. I was exhausted, hungry, and starting to feel disoriented. By the afternoon session, they introduced the next level of the program. It was a month-long intensive that cost $15,000 and took place at their main center in another state. They brought out contracts and said this weekend was just the introduction. That real transformation required commitment. People were signing up enthusiastically, talking about how they'd sell things or max out credit cards to afford it because this was more important than anything. I refused outright, and that's when things shifted. The facilitators said my resistance was exactly why I needed the program most. My boyfriend joined in, pleading with me to trust the process, saying he'd already signed up for the month-long intensive and wanted me to come. Other participants circled around, not physically threatening, but creating this psychological pressure where everyone was telling me I was making a huge mistake, that I was letting fear control me, that I was choosing to stay broken. I waited until the next outdoor session, some kind of nature walk meditation thing. We were moving through the woods, and I deliberately lagged behind. When there was enough distance, I just bolted. Ran through the trees in what I hoped was the direction of the main road. I could hear people calling after me, then footsteps running. I didn't stop. My lungs were burning and branches were scratching my arms, but I kept going until I hit the dirt road. I ran down it for what felt like forever until a pickup truck came along. The driver saw me bleeding and panicked and got me out of there. The police called it a known group that's been involved in multiple lawsuits. Several people have gone missing after attending their month-long programs. Have you ever been in a group situation where you realized too late that something was very wrong? What made you decide to get out? I'll never forget the day I realized my perfect match was actually an algorithm-generated fantasy. I'm 35, work in finance, and I'd tried pretty much every dating app out there with limited success. A colleague told me about this exclusive platform that required extensive personality testing and income verification, supposedly using advanced matching technology to find truly compatible partners. The application process took 2 hours, asking everything from childhood memories to ethical dilemmas to spending habits. They promised their system was so sophisticated that matches had an 80% long-term success rate. When I finally got approved and matched with someone, I was genuinely excited. Her profile showed we had virtually identical interests. She loved the same obscure jazz musicians I did, referenced books I'd read multiple times, even had opinions on specific neighborhoods and cities I'd lived in years ago. Our messaging chemistry was incredible. She got every reference, laughed at jokes that usually fell flat, and seemed to intuitively understand my communication style. After 2 weeks of talking, we met for dinner at a wine bar downtown. In person, she was exactly as attractive as her photos, which was already unusual in online dating. But what really struck me was how perfectly the conversation flowed. I mentioned I'd had a rough day dealing with a difficult client, and she immediately steered the discussion towards stress management techniques, then casually brought up this documentary about workplace culture that she thought I'd love. I made a mental note to watch it because she was right. It did sound interesting. When the waiter came, she ordered a wine I'd gotten at a different restaurant weeks earlier on a date that hadn't gone well. I hadn't mentioned it to her. When I commented on the coincidence, she just smiled and said she had good instincts about these things. Over the next few dates, little things kept standing out. She'd reference my preferences before I'd stated them. She knew I took my coffee black with 1 sugar, even though we'd never gotten coffee together. She mentioned loving a specific hiking trail I'd posted about in a fitness forum under a username that wasn't connected to my real identity. Each time I'd point out how she knew these things, she'd have an explanation ready. Good memory. Lucky guess. Common preference among people with similar backgrounds. The breaking point came during our 5th date at her apartment. We were watching a movie on her laptop, and she got up to refill our drinks. Her phone was on the coffee table, and a notification popped up. I wasn't trying to snoop, but the preview was visible, and it said, "Suggestion. Mention his mother's cooking, positive childhood association." I stared at it, confused, and then another notification appeared. Redirect conversation if he mentions ex-wife. Use humor deflection. When she came back, I asked her directly what those notifications were. She got flustered in a way I hadn't seen before, defensive, saying it was just a coaching app she used to improve her communication skills. I pressed harder, and she finally admitted she was part of something called a relationship optimization program through the dating platform. They'd given her access to my full profile, not just what I could see, but everything. Every answer I'd provided during that 2-hour application process, my psychological assessment, my dating history that I disclosed, my spending patterns, even my preferences that the app had extrapolated from my behavior on the platform. She had been receiving real-time coaching during our dates through an earpiece I'd never noticed. An artificial intelligence system analyzed everything I said and fed her optimized responses designed to maximize my attraction and engagement. The wine she'd ordered, the documentaries she'd mentioned, the hiking trail, none of it was coincidence. It was all data-driven manipulation. She showed me the interface on her phone, and it was extensive. Psychological triggers to use, topics to avoid, even suggested body language based on my stated preferences. I asked her why she'd agree to this, and she got emotional, saying she was being paid per date to help refine the system. The company was developing AI-assisted relationship tools and needed real-world testing. She claimed she actually did like me, that not everything was scripted, but she couldn't tell me which parts were genuine and which were algorithmic suggestions. When I asked how she'd know the difference herself at this point, she didn't have an answer. I looked back at the terms of service I'd agreed to when joining the platform. Really read through the dense legal language this time. Buried in Section 12 was consent for data sharing with partner optimization services for research purposes. I'd agreed to let them sell my entire psychological profile to test subjects who were essentially paid to date me. I wasn't the only one. She told me there were dozens of people in the program, maybe hundreds, all being matched with paying users who had no idea they were test cases. The worst part was looking back at every moment that had felt special or serendipitous and realizing it had been calculated. The time she'd brought me soup when I mentioned feeling sick, she'd been prompted to do that. The inside jokes we'd developed, those had been A/B tested with other users to see what created the strongest bonding response. Even her vulnerability, the personal stories she'd shared that made me feel close to her, I'd never know if those were real or strategic deployments of manufactured intimacy. I reported the platform to consumer protection agencies, but the legal team was sophisticated. Everything was technically disclosed in the terms of service. I deleted my profile, but the data they'd collected doesn't just disappear. Somewhere there's a comprehensive psychological map of exactly how to manipulate me into feeling connected to someone, and I have no control over what happens to that information. Have you ever wondered if someone you were dating was too good to be true? Would you want to know if your connection was being artificially engineered, or is ignorance better? I was 28 when I reconnected with someone from elementary school through social media. We'd been in the same class for a couple of years before his family moved away, and I barely remembered him beyond a vague recollection of a quiet kid who sat near the back of the classroom. He sent me a friend request with a message saying he'd been thinking about old times and wanted to catch up. It seemed innocent enough, so I accepted, and we chatted briefly about what we'd been up to since childhood. He suggested meeting for coffee to properly reminisce, and I figured why not. I had fond memories of that school, and thought it might be fun to compare notes on how we remembered things. When I arrived at the coffee shop, he was already there with flowers. Not a huge bouquet, just a small arrangement, but it immediately felt odd for what I thought was a casual catch-up between old classmates. He handed them to me with this nervous smile and said he wanted to make a good impression. I took them awkwardly and sat down, trying to lighten the mood by joking about how formal he was being. He laughed but seemed hurt, like I'd missed something important. The conversation started normally enough, talking about teachers we'd had and kids we'd known, but then he started referencing things I had no memory of. He described how we used to sit together at lunch every day and share our snacks. I gently corrected him, saying I didn't think that happened, that I usually sat with a group of girls whose names I could still remember. He insisted I was wrong, that my memory was just fuzzy after all these years. He described it in such specific detail, what I supposedly packed, what he brought, how we'd trade items. It was weirdly elaborate for something that never occurred. Then he brought up Valentine exchanges from 4th grade. He said I'd given him a special card, not one of the generic ones everyone got, but one I'd made specifically for him with a personal message. He claimed I'd drawn hearts on it and written that he was my best friend. I had zero recollection of this, and I told him so. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of a card that did look handmade, but I couldn't confirm I'd created it. He seemed almost offended that I didn't remember this supposedly pivotal moment. As he kept talking, the story grew more concerning. He described a whole relationship between us that had never existed. According to him, we were inseparable throughout 3rd and 4th grade, practically a couple even at that age. He talked about promises we'd supposedly made to each other about staying friends forever, about how devastated he was when his family moved, about how he'd thought about me constantly over the years. None of this matched my reality at all. I tried multiple times to redirect, to explain that while we'd been classmates, we'd never been particularly close. But he wouldn't accept it. He'd counter every correction with more specific details, as if the sheer volume of his memories could overwrite my own. He showed me a collection of photos he'd printed out from my social media going back years. Pictures from college, from vacations, from job promotions. He'd organized them chronologically in a small photo album and interspersed them with old elementary school class photos, where we were both visible in the background. He started talking about how he'd been planning this reunion for months, waiting for the right time in both our lives. He mentioned that he'd followed my relationship status online and knew when I'd broken up with my previous partner last year. He'd deliberately waited 6 months after that to reach out, giving me time to heal so we could start fresh. The way he phrased it made it sound like we were getting back together after a separation, not two near strangers having coffee. When I firmly stated that we'd never dated, that we'd barely known each other as children, his face fell. But instead of accepting it, he looked confused and hurt. He said he understood I might have blocked out some memories because the separation had been traumatic, that sometimes people suppress painful experiences. He suggested maybe I needed time to process and remember things correctly. The fact that he seemed to genuinely believe this alternate history made it so much more disturbing than if he'd been obviously lying. I stood up to leave, putting money on the table for my coffee. He grabbed my wrist, not violently, but firmly, and said we needed to work through this together, that running away wouldn't help us rebuild what we'd had. I pulled my arm back and told him clearly that there was nothing to rebuild, because there had never been anything between us. His expression shifted then, just for a moment. The confusion was replaced with something colder, more aware. Then just as quickly, he looked hurt again and released my wrist. I left the coffee shop and blocked him on all social media immediately. Within hours, he'd created new accounts and started messaging me about our perfect date, about how he knew I just needed time, about how patient he'd be while I remembered our shared past. He posted about our relationship on his timeline, writing as if we'd been together for months. Friends who knew him started congratulating him, completely unaware that his version of events was fictional. I had to get a restraining order after he showed up at my workplace, saying he was there to take me to lunch like we'd supposedly planned. The legal process was surreal because he genuinely seemed to believe every word of his story. Even months later, I'll sometimes see him driving slowly past my apartment, and I have no idea if he's still living in his delusion or if he always knew the truth and just refused to accept my reality over his fantasy. Have you ever had someone insist something happened when you know it didn't? How do you handle it when someone's memory of you doesn't match your memory of yourself? I was 38 and recently divorced when I decided to try dating apps again after a 15-year marriage. The whole landscape had changed since I'd last been single, and I felt completely out of my depth. I matched with someone who seemed normal and professional, her profile showing she worked in marketing and enjoyed hiking and good restaurants. Our conversations were pleasant but unremarkable, which actually felt like a relief after reading horror stories about online dating. We agreed to meet for dinner at an Italian place downtown on a Thursday evening. She arrived right on time, well-dressed and polite. We ordered drinks and started the usual first date small talk about work and hobbies. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until a homeless man approached our outdoor table, asking if we could spare any change. I politely declined, saying I didn't have cash on me, which was true. The man moved on without issue, but I noticed she was typing something into her phone. I thought maybe she was texting a friend or checking work messages, so I didn't comment on it. Our waiter came to take our order, and he was noticeably rude to her. Short responses, barely making eye contact, acting put out when she asked questions about the menu. I figured he was just having a bad night, but I made sure to be extra polite to compensate. She watched how I interacted with him, and again I saw her making notes on her phone. When I asked if everything was okay, she smiled and said she was just keeping track of some work stuff. Midway through dinner, the waiter accidentally knocked over a water glass while refilling it, spilling water across the table near her. He apologized quickly and cleaned it up, but seemed flustered. I told him it was no problem, accidents happen, and helped move our plates out of the way. Nothing about my response felt unusual, but she was back on her phone immediately, typing rapidly. At this point, I was getting annoyed by how much attention she was paying to her device instead of our conversation. Then something weird happened. A woman at the bar kept making eye contact with me and smiling. When my date excused herself to use the restroom, this woman came over and started flirting pretty openly, asking if I was here alone and if I wanted to buy her a drink. I told her politely that I was on a date and not interested. She walked away without pushing it. When my date returned, I didn't mention it because it seemed irrelevant. But I noticed her glancing toward the bar with what looked like satisfaction. About 10 minutes later, she set her phone on the table and said she wanted to explain something. She told me she uses what she called a systematic vetting process for all her first dates. My stomach dropped as she explained that the homeless man, the rude waiter, the spilled water, and the woman at the bar were all planned tests. They were people she'd hired to evaluate my character in different scenarios. The homeless man tested my compassion and generosity. The rude waiter tested my patience and how I treat service workers. The spilled water tested my reaction to mistakes. The woman at the bar tested my faithfulness and boundary setting. She pulled out a tablet from her bag and showed me what she called her evaluation rubric. It was a detailed spreadsheet with dozens of criteria, each with a point system. Things like eye contact during conversation, ratio of questions asked versus talking about myself, whether I offered to pay or suggested splitting the bill, how I reacted to waitstaff, political views that came up naturally in conversation. Each category had scores, and she'd been filling them out throughout our date. I sat there stunned as she explained that I'd failed several key tests. I didn't give money to the homeless man, which she marked as showing lack of empathy. I didn't defend her to the rude waiter, which indicated I wouldn't stand up for a partner. She had pages of notes about micro-expressions I'd made, topics I'd chosen to discuss or avoid, even my body language when certain subjects came up. It was the most invasive, calculated thing I'd ever experienced. She casually mentioned that she wasn't the only one doing this. She was part of an online community of women who shared strategies for scientifically evaluating potential partners. They had databases of common tests, scoring methodologies, and even hired the same actors in different cities. As she talked, I noticed other couples in the restaurant and wondered with horror if they were doing the same thing. She pointed out 2 other women she knew were conducting evaluations that same night. Then came the threat. She said she'd recorded our entire date with a hidden camera in her purse, which was angled to capture both of us. She was planning to create a compilation video of all my failures to share with her community as a warning about men who present well but don't pass deeper scrutiny. She'd post it online with enough identifying information that anyone searching my name would find it. I pointed out that recording someone without consent was illegal in our state, that what she was doing was a massive violation of privacy. She countered that I'd been evaluating her too, just less systematically, and that all dating is essentially testing compatibility. When I said there's a difference between getting to know someone and running covert operations with hired actors, she accused me of being defensive because I'd failed her tests. I left cash for my portion of the meal and walked out. I consulted with a lawyer who said that while ethically wrong, proving she'd actually recorded anything or would follow through on her threats was difficult. I became paranoid about every subsequent date, analyzing interactions for signs of manipulation. Was that person who bumped into us planted? Was that server's attitude genuine or staged? The worst part was never knowing who was real and who was performing a role in someone else's evaluation. I still date occasionally, but I can't shake the feeling of being constantly assessed by invisible criteria, scored on a rubric I'll never see, failing tests I don't know I'm taking. Have you ever felt like you were being tested on a date without your knowledge? How do you tell the difference between someone getting to know you and someone conducting an investigation? Thanks for listening to these unsettling dating experiences here on Untold Whispers. If these stories made you think twice about your own dating life, hit that subscribe button and share your most uncomfortable date story in the comments below. Stay safe out there. And remember, trust your instincts.